Hello to all who are here and to those watching the live stream. Thank you for taking time to listen to my work in progress, one looking at the earliest Filipino American communities in San Francisco. Thank you to Executive Director Todd Mayberry, Lana Constantini, John Freeman, and the staff of Strategic Development Technologies for making this presentation possible. So this presentation is San Francisco-centric, but I will try to explain certain place names for the benefit of people who are not familiar with the city. There are now about 45,800 San Franciscans of Filipino descent. That's just 5% of San Francisco's population, but it seems like we're everywhere. Yeah, good. We are. And let us know about why and how we got here in the first place. How many here are familiar with the city's Manila town on Kearny Street? A lot. Or with the characteristics describing the earliest Filipino communities here in San Francisco, in California, or in the mainland. There is no doubt that Manila town, Kearny Street, played an important function for the nascent Filipino American community in San Francisco during the early decades of the 20th century. It was there where many new arrivals learned of employment opportunities and where seafarers on leave and migratory workers found accommodations, familiar food, and kinship. I hope, however, that this presentation will expand your notion of the pioneering Filipinos, not just in San Francisco or in California, but the rest of the mainland. But why are Filipinos in America in the first place? Here's a very truncated timeline. Pre-colonization Philippines was a collection of distinct tribal groups with varying degrees of political and social organizations, with so many different languages too. For hundreds of years, they traded with countries to the north, to the south, and to the west as far as India. Except for that incident where Magellan was killed, there was supposedly little resistance to the arrival of Spanish colonialists in the 15th century. What stood out in the 300 plus years under Spanish rule was the galleon trade, a period of 250 years plying the Pacific Ocean between Manila and Acapulco. It was not just a trade of goods, but of culture and of people as well, as over time Filipino marineros would jump ship in Mexico, as did their Mexican counterparts when they got to the Philippines. And even before this global exchange ended in 1815, British and American trading ships began employing skilled Filipino seafarers, whom they called Manila men, bringing them to far-flung corners of the world, including the U.S. There are pockets of resistance against Spain over the centuries, but in 1898, Filipino revolutionaries triumphed over Spanish rule. This was unfortunately thwarted by the American victory in the Battle of Manila Bay. The United States bought the Philippines from Spain for $20 million, and the subsequent Philippine-American War of Pacification was brutal and lasted for almost a decade in some regions. The Americans imposed its rule of benevolent assimilation. In addition to promoting public health programs, they introduced public education, and they taught their new wards the English language. So yes, we speak English. The colonial government's pensionado program sent mostly young Filipino men to study in the U.S., ostensibly to help prepare the Philippines for self-governance. Soon, hundreds more would self-finance their education in the U.S., many working as live-in domestics. When the initial plan to recruit single men to work in Hawaii's sugar plantations in 1906 failed, families in depressed regions were enticed to move to the islands with 3-year contracts. And when those contracts expired, many families moved on to the mainland. By the mid-1920s, thousands more would ship out directly to the mainland, mainly to the West Coast. Almost half of the Filipino working men in the West Coast were farm workers, many following crop growing cycles. The increasing number of Filipinos arriving in the mainland presented a problem for individuals and groups opposed to what they feared was a new Asiatic invasion. The problem was the Philippines was an American territory, and Filipinos were considered U.S. nationals and therefore not subject to immigration quotas. As the Filipinos' numbers grew, racist characterizations of the new arrivals flourished. Nativists especially sowed the notion that the young, predominantly single Filipino men lacked normal, stable home lives or family ties as they moved with the changing seasons, that they were fond of gambling and other vices, and perhaps most worrying was their casual interaction with young white women. Policymakers and even scholars observing that first surge of Filipinos came to agree not only about the lack of permanent settlements, but to all the other conjectures attached to the migratory young male population. Stockton or Little Manila and the Manila towns in other cities were seen as temporary gathering centers of restaurants, pool halls, barbershops, gambling dens, and taxi dance halls and residential hotels or SROs, often on the edges of existing Chinatowns. These earliest immigrants were called the Manong generation. Manong, a term of respect addressing an older male, became associated with a community of transient farmer and cannery workers who gambled and frequented taxi dance halls. These characterizations have been repeated from those early years through the present as this sampler shows. These were characteristics of a population that seemed not to have evolved over the 3 decades of living in the U.S. The narrative for San Francisco's Manila town is quite extraordinary.
The Filipino men settled along the West Coast. In San Francisco, about 30,000 of them started forming a community here on a 10-block stretch right along the spine of Chinatown on Kearny Street. It was the start of Manila Town. Outside of this area, Filipino workers found it hard to find any affordable housing, and that was by design. The city, at large, was strictly racially segregated.
As soon as they crossed the borders of Manila Town, like here, past Broadway and into surrounding white communities, they were shut out and denied apartments.
And even if you walked 2 blocks that way, you could get beat up, even killed.
They had white vigilante groups that would hunt them down, try to take them out of town, murder them.
That forced Filipino men to stay within the boundaries of Manila Town. But despite the constraints, they found a way to build a home for themselves.
So dramatic and very moving, right? It is now the most prevalent narrative as this video has had 1.7 million views. If you haven't seen the video, it's worth a watch, if only to learn about the 1977 international hotel eviction. The brutal and much publicized eviction of elderly Filipino and Chinese tenants of a residential hotel on Kearny Street has come to symbolize the history and struggles of the Manongs in San Francisco. But the story is far more complex than what was portrayed in the video. To unravel the mystery, I delved into the details, poring over city directories, land use maps, newspapers, and other printed materials of the period, as well as more recent ones. This particular book, for example, this picture book has a lot of pictures that I used on this slideshow. And this publication from the 1930s, written by a Filipino journalist, talked about his experience from 1925 to 1930. And he offered a picture that was far more fuller than just cannery workers and transient farm workers. He fell in love with San Francisco, by the way. So I think I liked him for that. Crucial in my project were the Census Bureau enumeration records. These historical documents include data systematically collected over time, including addresses that can be mapped. First, I found no reports of vigilante mobs hunting Filipinos out of San Francisco. The clippings in the video were probably from the 1929-1930 riots in Exeter or Watsonville. These are official population numbers from the Census Bureau for context. The slow growth between 1930 and 1940 was due to the Tidings-McDuffie Act of 1935, which reclassified Filipinos as aliens and curtailed their immigration to the mainland to an annual quota of 50. A repatriation program in the 1930s also sent almost 2,200 Filipinos back to the Philippines. 30,000 Filipinos living in Manila town is surely an exaggeration, as the total number of non-white San Franciscans were less than that. Also, it's suspiciously similar to the total Filipino population in California. That number could have been a slip-up at one time, but it had been repeatedly used from about 2005 onwards. And for giant fans out here, 30,650 was the average attendance in the 2021 and 2022 home games. Imagine that crowd size of just Filipino men crammed into 2 3-story residential hotels along Kearny Street. By 1940, 60% of Filipinos in the U.S. mainland had settled in urban areas. This was especially pronounced in the Midwest and the East Coast, but in California, the split was even. Most Filipinos had home lives. They formed households as head of households with family relations or with non-relations, both Filipino and non-Filipino, living in apartments, duplexes, or even single-family homes. They were not as transient as was assumed. And in this table on the lower corner, in San Francisco, less than a quarter were in non-household situations, such as living in residential hotels, work dormitories, barracks, ship quarters, and institutional settings like hospitals or jails. And even amongst Filipinos in the rural settings, like likely farm workers, over half of them live in households. So this map shows the 1940 boundaries of Manila town between Sacramento and Pacific on the eastern edge of San Francisco's Chinatown, according to the Philippine Information Bureau, which was operating on Kearny Street in 1940. I should note these boundaries expanded and contracted over time. Kearny Street, as a Filipino commercial center, reached its height in the 1950s when the Filipino population grew after the Second World War. This was where barbers, billiards, restaurants, and other Filipino-operated businesses were clustered. Back then, contemporaneous Filipinos called Kearny Street the Escolta, after the main commercial street of Binondo, Manila's Chinatown. So where did the earliest Filipinos in San Francisco live? The maps I'll show you are all based on enumeration records of decennial censuses. They are at best a snapshot taken every 10 years, but they're records that can show patterns over time. Filipino was introduced as a distinct racial category in the 1900 U.S. Census, an acknowledgement perhaps of the U.S.'s recently required territory. The beige blocks are the Chinatown boundaries in 1940, and the red line represents Kearny Street from Sacramento to Pacific, the 1940 boundaries of Manila town. For reference, I've included Broadway as it intersects with Kearny. Broadway was, according to the video, the border beyond which Filipinos were denied housing. Above Broadway, Kearny climbs up Telegraph Hill into what was then the Latin Quarter. While the 1900 census counted 0 Filipinos in San Francisco, there were 12.5 men who were born in the Philippines who worked in unskilled or lowly positions. Their racial classifications included white, black, mulatto, or other, likely based on the enumerator's assessment of their skin color. One of them, Florentino Navarro, landed in the U.S. in 1848. In the 1900 and 1910 censuses, Filipinos were undercounted, meaning they were counted but assigned to a racial category other than Filipino. In 1910, a handful of Filipinos were living in Chinatown, but most were not. Do note that the census was conducted just 4 years after the 1906 earthquake and Great Fire. Chinatown was rebuilt quickly, and there are 30 Filipinos in the Presidio, mess boys and valets to military officers and a couple of nannies. The Presidio is the military base where forces in the Spanish and Filipino American wars were deployed. Over 100 seafarers are shown along here on the wharves, although they were technically out at sea. There were 44 Filipino cannery workers in the 7-unit apartment building. In later years, we will see similar instances of Filipinos leasing whole buildings to rent out to fellow men. And there were only a handful of Filipinos in this building at the time of the census, but this was the Casa de Rizal. This news article claims that the Casa de Rizal was built by Filipinos with their own hands in 1907. This is unlikely, as most of them were students who spoke Spanish and would have come from prominent families and not used to hard labor. The Casa de Rizal was a Filipino clubhouse and had lodgings for transient workers. This image of Igorotes was included, perhaps as a contrast to the westernized adopted sons of Uncle Sam. In 1905, there was a several-month-long exhibit of the primitive Igorotes from the U.S. possession. Such human zoos of Filipinos were common attractions in major U.S. cities, including San Francisco, clearly upsetting privileged Filipino students who were vocal about their concerns of being linked to their, quote, uncivilized countrymen. By 1920, Kearny Street was a Filipino enclave. However, numbers living outside of Kearny Street also increased, both in the Tender Knob Hill area and west of Van Ness Street. There were about 200 Filipinos along Kearny and in Chinatown. And this is the International Hotel where 43 Filipinos were staying when the census was taken. The International Hotel was believed to be a favorite hotel to stay in by transient Filipino workers. By 1930, majority of Filipinos in San Francisco were living in flats and apartments, some even in detached houses further out in the Mission and in Bernal Heights. There is no doubt that they would have faced racial discrimination in their search for housing, and I will highlight an example later. But based on census records, Filipinos were able to secure housing in different neighborhoods in the city. There were more Filipinos living on Kearny Street than in Chinatown, about 345. Moreover, some 830 Filipinos were in the Tender Knob area, where many young single working people of different races were living in studios and efficiency apartments. Buildings of various sizes and types were leased by entrepreneurial Filipinos and rented out to their kababayans or countrymen. This apartment building was called Filipino Home and housed over 100 Filipinos. The Filipino Welfare Association was located here. Meanwhile, 85 Filipinos lived in this building on Golden Gate. Several apartments in the area housed over 20 Filipinos, or about the same number then living at the International Hotel. By 1930, the Western Addition area has clearly become a distinct settlement of Filipino families. About 670 Filipinos lived here, 110 of them children. I know it might get boring for me telling you how many children there were, but I needed to tell you that, given they were supposedly none. Given the scarcity of Filipinos, anti-miscegenation laws were often cited as the cause for the lack of families and home lives for Filipinos. But that law was not put in place in California until 1933, and hundreds of marriages have already transpired. And even with such restrictions, many young men found ways to marry non-Filipinos by getting married elsewhere, including New Mexico, Utah, and other states without such laws. Some even driving south to Mexico. Some didn't bother with getting married too. This is another leased building with 55 Filipino residents. It was in the Western Addition that Filipino social institutions were established. The Filipino Community Center, established in the 1930s, still stands on California Street. Other institutions or social organizations in the neighborhood included the Filipino Christian Fellowship, the Filipino Methodist Church, the Filipino Foreign Mission Society, and the Filipino Tennis Club. The Catholic Filipino Club was on Surrey Street and was inaugurated in 1922. It served as a social center with rooms for lodging. It had a restaurant and an informal employment agency for almost 2 decades. It even had a tennis court. The clubhouse opened with much fanfare, including a procession of Catholic organizations along Van Ness. The procession began at the Young Men's Institute, an Irish fraternal organization that opened their facilities to their fellow Catholic Filipinos. Rudolph Spreckels, heir to the sugar fortune, largely financed this repurposed mansion's purchase. Filipino families were also settling in residential enclaves of the mostly industrial south of Market. This 1940 map shows where Filipinos had settled in San Francisco on the eve of the Second World War. On Kearny Street and its environs, there were about 325 Filipinos, a much smaller number than 30,000. You may have been noticing that there were Filipinos living above Broadway through the years, except 1910. For decades, through the 1940s, that area was known as Little Mexico, and many Filipinos have found cultural affinity living with Latino neighbors. A substantial number of Filipino interracial marriages in San Francisco were with Latinas. In the south of Market District, the residential clusters were also getting denser. There were about 470 Filipinos by 1940, and over 100 were children. This is the Gran Oriente Filipino, a Masonic order established in 1921, started leasing this former Japanese lodging house in 1935. The fraternity did not purchase the building for their members and their families until 1948, and Filipinos continued to live there until it was acquired by a nonprofit housing developer in 2018. The Gran Oriente purchased and operated 2 other residential buildings across South Park and established their temple here in 1951. As Filipinos gained foothold in other neighborhoods, their numbers declined in the Tender Knob area. And the Filipino cluster in the Western Addition was fully established in 1940. There were over 1,300 Filipinos, over 30%, or about 410 were children. In the Western Addition, Filipino businesses include a couple of barbershops, billiards, a cigar store, a grocery store, a photography studio, and a musical instrument shop. There was a radio repair shop, which incidentally was operated by Joaquin Legaspi, the painter slash radio technician, who was credited as bestowing the identity of Manila Town for Kearny Street in the late 1960s. A U.S.-trained Filipino dentist, Dr. Conrado Ocampo, lived and practiced in the Western Addition from 1931 through his retirement 40 years later. In 1940, his dental office was on Kearny Street in Webster. His patients included Filipinos, Mexicans, Chinese, and, quote, Americans too. These establishments in the Western Addition appear to target a broader market, not just the Filipinos, given its population size. Hence, the cluster was not as visible as an enclave. As I mentioned earlier, many community institutions were here in the Western Addition. San Francisco had 0 taxi dance halls. Those wanting recreation in such venues would have to take a ferry to Oakland. But Filipinos were known to take over the Franklin Hall on Saturdays, where they danced to modern swing and jazz. They played tennis and softball at the Margaret Hayward Playground. The fraternal organization Caballeros de Dimasalang was also based in the Western Addition. There you go. Filipinos on the eve of the Second World War were not confined to Kearny Street. The maps showed that pioneering Filipinos in San Francisco had home lives and, especially by 1930, formed distinct settlement clusters outside of Kearny Street. All these preceded the post-war second surge of mass migration with war brides and families that supposedly tamed and settled the nomadic Manongs. Was the Filipino presence in the Western Addition known? In addition to references in books about San Francisco neighborhoods acknowledging the Filipino colonies, here's a 1940 quote from the beloved chronicler of San Francisco, Herb Cain. According to a 1940 guidebook to San Francisco's ethnic communities, African Americans before the war lived west of Fillmore. The Japanese were firmly in Japantown above Geary, and clusters of Filipino families were mostly along Geary and O'Farrell, from Laguna to Webster. Post Street was where the communities intersected. I cannot help but share this other Cain shout-out. A Filipino barber was apparently an influencer in his days. Before I forget, let's go back to the San Francisco is Racist by Design map. Some of you may recognize this as a redlining map, created and used by the Federal Homeowners Loan Corporation to assess mortgage lending risk. The colors, which were not explained in the video, meant that the red areas were hazardous lending risk, yellow neighborhoods were in decline, the blues were good, and the green had the best or lowest risk. Integrated and working class neighborhoods were inevitably assigned red or yellow. Kearny Street and Chinatown were not residential areas, hence the double hashing. The video seemed to imply that because Filipinos were not in the colorful blocks, they were racially segregated. In fact, most Filipinos were living in the red and yellow neighborhoods. Those who were living in blue or green neighborhoods were likely live in domestics. So here's what it looks like with the workers sticking out. There were still Filipinos living in the blue and green areas. Now I'll talk about the Filipinos in San Francisco back then. These are the 1940 statistics, the first time such detailed aggregation was made available that listed Filipinos as a racial category and separated from the catch-all others category. By 1940, the difference between urban and rural Filipino Americans had implications. Rural Filipinos were likely isolated, and that isolation included little contact with women. Social diversion and activities that Filipinos in cities had access to were mostly denied them. You'll see that San Francisco Filipinos were better educated. I will refrain from guessing which came first, educated Filipinos settling in the cities, or that settling in the cities provided better access and opportunities for further schooling. Higher educational attainment, however, did not always lead to commensurate livelihoods because of discrimination. Occupations available to urban Filipinos had often been described simply as menial domestic work. And work in cities may be varied, but most Filipinos in San Francisco were indeed employed in domestic and service work. Though menial, these jobs provided annual wages that allowed them to raise a family. Postal clerks, yes, even back then Filipinos were already working for the U.S. Post Office. They earned about 2,300, while a pantryman over 2,000. Government clerks, 1,800, and hotel and private cooks earned 1,600. Even the lowest menial domestic work paid at least $800 a year. Wages for farm workers at that time were anywhere from 300 to 600 a year. So it was pretty easy to start. Filipinos in cities like San Francisco established fraternal and Masonic lodges such as the Gran Oriente Filipino, Caballeros de Mazalan, and Legionarios del Trabajo. Their wives organized as auxiliaries of these orders. They formed mutual aid societies, regional and town associations. They had tennis and softball clubs. They competed against other Filipino teams statewide and with other San Francisco neighborhood teams. Pictures of the Merchants baseball team. But according to news reports of matches, it was the Filipino Athletic Club that was the winningest team. So we have to look for a picture of them. Incidentally, this is Celestino Alfafara, a Philippine-trained lawyer and community leader who filed and won the test case in 1945 that allowed Filipinos to own land in California. Beyond their frequent letters to the editor, this generation was very active. They really, really took advantage of letters to the editor. And very eloquent a lot of times. Filipinos made sure their civic and community activities were publicized in the mainstream papers. They do know how to do those public service announcements. They had fundraising drives. Their victories in sporting matches were reported in the papers. Their cultural programs and other celebrations. Some names even appeared on the society pages of San Francisco's dailies, featuring birthdays, wedding anniversaries, and visiting dignitaries from the Philippines. The longest-running celebration was the annual Rizal Day, honoring the Philippines' national hero. The first Rizal Day announced in local papers was in 1907. By the late 1920s, the Rizal Day Queen competition started gaining more attention, especially the associated scandals and riots making the front pages of the local dailies. Rizal Day for the community was a big deal, and over the years, the venues got bigger and grander. Several of the Rizal Day celebrations were held at the Civic Center Auditorium or the Scottish Rite Temple, now known as the Regency Center. They knew how to celebrate. An extreme gender imbalance was a significant characteristic of this early community. In 1940, there were only 5,800 Filipinos in the whole of the U.S., and 77% of them lived in urban areas. In 1940, in 1940, 16% of Filipinos in San Francisco were female, about 570, and about half of them were born in the U.S., meaning most were still girls and not yet marriageable. Current narratives emphasize the sex imbalance, but not much more. Filipinos of that period, however, were hardly passive. Newspaper accounts revealed them as participating in civic life, hosting fundraisers, and performing in cultural events. About a quarter of working-age Filipinos in San Francisco worked, comparable to the overall U.S. female population. They also had a higher proportion in the professions. Granted, that only meant two women. One was a physician and the other was Lourdes Bolioso, and according to the caption here, was head nurse of Ward C at the UCSF hospital and was an eminent pianist, consummate singer, and an orator. She was also once a candidate for the Miss Rizal Day Queen. Estela Sulit, a lawyer from the Philippines, spoke on contemporary issues before various functions, mostly American women's clubs. And this is Pilar Guerrero, who testified before the San Francisco Board of Supervisors, decrying the racism her family and other Filipinos like her faced as they searched for housing in the city. She was a journalist and she knew how to keep the issue on the news for a couple of weeks. After the Second World War, Mrs. Sulit and Mrs. Guerrero worked for the newly independent Philippines, serving as consul generals at the San Francisco Philippine Consulate. The Filipino Mothers Club was established in 1930. There was also a Filipino Children's Club. By 1940, there were about 800 Filipino Americans 18 years and under in San Francisco, roughly 22% of the total, almost all of them U.S. born. About 3 out of 5 were biracial. The Mothers Club and the Children's Club represented the community with their dances and programs at various civic and cultural events. Their largest audiences were during the Philippine Days at the 1939-1940 Golden Gate International Exposition. I hope I don't trigger memories of children. For children of immigrants forced to perform native dances, but these children sang and danced at the World's Fair. Ani Paredes remembered dancing the bakya and the bangko dances. He was an especially skilled ballet dancer and caught the attention of ballet and opera goers for his grace and whimsy. The World's Fair at Treasure Island was the biggest event for the San Francisco Bay Area's Filipino Americans. One of the popular exhibitions was the Philippine Pavilion, built with financial contributions from the community. Besides the speeches, the song and dances, there was even a Filipino aviation club which flew demonstration stunts. But that club was based in the East Bay, so that's all I'll say about them. A concession stand introduced Philippine cuisine to fairgoers and highlighted Filipino bartenders' mettle. Filipino pride, however, was bruised when police at the fair admonished the crowds to, quote, beware of Filipino pickpockets. Yeah. The Filipino Community Center of San Francisco sent in a formal request, and the police stopped including Filipino in their warnings. By the 1940s, a generation of Filipinos born or raised in America was forging a life in San Francisco without role models before them. Victoria Manalo Draves was born and raised in South of Market. If name is destiny, then she was fated to win the 2 golds at the 1948 Olympics, both in high dive categories. Victoria's victory, of course, and Manalo is Tagalog for to win. She was the first Asian American woman and first Filipino American to win gold for the U.S. Her father was a chef and a musician, her mother an immigrant from England. The story often told of Manalo was that her coach pressured her to use her mother's surname when she first started competing at local meets. But what she did later is often omitted. So after a year or two of competing as Vicky Taylor, she had her first interview with a sports reporter. So she told him her name was Vicky Manalo. Her coach chewed her out for this, but her teammates didn't seem to mind that she was biracial, and neither did her fans. The famed San Francisco swimming coach Charlie Saba helped Manalo find new coaches who had no problems with her Filipino surname. By the way, she later married the third coach who trained her to Olympic standards. A neighborhood park in south of Market now bears her name. Carlos Villa was an award-winning visual artist, an educator, a major figure in the local and regional art scene, and an activist championing multiculturalism in the arts. He was born in the Tenderloin and lived in his first 12 years in the basement unit of an apartment building where his father was a janitor. Their home became a hangout for his parents' townmates. Villa was introduced to art and was inspired by his cousin Leo Valledor, an equally talented and groundbreaking artist in his own right. Many of Villa's work were massive expressions of his experiences and exploration as a Filipino American. He especially celebrated his father's generation of single isolated men, Filipino Americans visiting the 2022 retrospective of his work at the Asian Art Museum, inevitably recognized and connected with distinctly Filipino American memories in Villa's pieces. This dynamic and bold piece made me smile even more so when I saw its title, My Dad Seeing Market Street for the First Time. Because really, who forgets the first time they saw Market Street? The rhythm and blues singer, songwriter, and dancer Sugar Pie DeSanto was born in New York but was raised in the Western Addition. So she was named after her grandmother, Umpelia Balinton, and was born to a black mother who trained as a concert pianist and a father who, despite being a Filipino, apparently, quote, couldn't carry a tune in the bucket. That's Sugar Pie's description of him. The family moved to San Francisco when she was 4. Growing up, her best friend was Etta James, and they started singing the Fillmore as teenagers. Her father, a strict and devout Catholic, wasn't thrilled by his daughter's passion. It was Johnny Otis who gave her the name Little Miss Sugar Pie and signed her on for recording when she was just 19. Sugar Pie continued to perform well into her 80s. In addition to her numerous awards, she was inducted to the Blues Hall of Fame in 2024. She died last month at the age of 89. Here's a gallery that includes community activist Bill Soto and Al Robles, who both grew up in the Western Addition. These gallery represents the better-known figures of the first generation of Filipino Americans born in San Francisco before 1940. This gallery also matches the fact that 3 in 5 of this generation were biracial. There you go, the state of San Francisco Filipino Americans on the eve of Second World War. Kearny Street served as a Filipino commercial center and a way station for seafarers and migratory workers. Its residential hotels did not make it ideal for those who settled down. Despite the racism and other indignities they may have faced, Filipinos in San Francisco found housing in various neighborhoods, many in the Western Addition, the Tender Knob, North Beach, and south of Market. Others went further afield to the Mission and Bernal Heights, some even out to the avenues. They formed households with their families and other relatives, their townmates, their co-workers, their countrymen. They got married, many before and others despite anti-miscegenation laws in the coastal states. They had children. Their children took piano and dance lessons and performed before crowds. They had social lives. They competed in intramural sports. And they engaged in civic functions. They fought for their rights and their dignity to live in this country. The Second World War will change their settlement patterns as many moved westward and southward, and new immigrants started arriving. But those who came in the first 4 decades of the 20th century called San Francisco their home. I hope that this presentation expanded your understanding of the Filipino American experience as gleaned through historical records and documents, and will encourage deeper digging into the history of other pioneering Filipinos in other cities and towns. We need to look at the nuances of that history, especially social stratification and tensions that were not visible. When the narrative was simplified to transient workers lacking stable home lives, gambling their wages away, and forced into housing in, quote, less salubrious areas. My work is just beginning. There are so many more stories to uncover. Thank you.
Teresa over there. Now that I have a mic, I can be heard. Questions and answers. All you do is raise your hand, and I'll recognize you, and you will have to wait till somebody brings you the microphone because this is being transcribed. And so that's the only. We get okay. So right by the my microphone. Take the question, please.
Or were there ones in Los Angeles, or if you want to speak on the other parts of California?
So San Francisco was one of the port cities that they would have arrived in Seattle and Los Angeles too. There were people who were arriving in Hawaii, but Hawaii at that time wasn't a state yet, so they were counted separately. But yeah, San Francisco was one of the port towns that Filipinos would land at, and most of them would actually go on to Stockton and other agricultural towns where there would be work. But Filipinos did settle in San Francisco, and there would I would think that also be similar in Seattle and Los Angeles, where the Filipino community that settled would be living outside of Manila town, of their Manila towns.
Another question. Right there.
Compared to the Chinese population, how was the discrimination against the Filipinos compared to what the Chinese endured?
There's nothing can compare to how the Chinese community was treated. By the time the Filipinos arrived, there would have been the Chinese would have been here over 100. No, they would have been here about 50 years, and by 1940 they would have been here 100 years. And the Japanese arrived in the 1890s. I'm trying to remember. So I think when the Filipinos first came to the U.S., they were so few in numbers, and they also had an advantage that the Chinese and Japanese didn't have. They spoke Spanish in the beginning, and so California had just become a state, and Spanish was still one of the languages. So so they were better able to integrate into some of the communities. They were first they were few in numbers. They didn't. I think it wasn't until the mid 1919s and 1920s that Filipinos started coming, and they did faced discrimination, mostly in the smaller towns, because their population was much more pronounced. If they start going to smaller towns, their proportion would be much higher. But in San Francisco, if you start off with students coming here, students from privileged backgrounds, it was different. It wasn't until the nativists started fomenting, these racist characterizations of Filipinos as nomadic and after are women. That was pretty much the problem they saw with Filipinos.
Let me just add that in my research, from the 1850s on, Chinese are here, and the Filipinos are not to be seen. I mean, they're not here at all.
Yeah.
So the Chinese established themselves very poorly. I mean, I've seen whole pages of Chinese. The occupations, these were women, were sometimes maids and so forth. And the reality was the census taker couldn't help himself. At the bottom of the page, he says, the above named Asiatics are all prostitutes.
Yeah.
Wasn't his role,
Yeah.
but he was
They
it
did.
was his racial attitude. So the Chinese are a completely different
Yeah.
population in terms of the beginning of their occupancy and residency in California.
So when I was checking some of the census records, I mentioned earlier that they were assigned racial categories that were not Filipino.
Yes.
Because the Filipinos would probably say they're Malay, or the enumerator would make an assumption of what they are. Florentino Navarro, the one who arrived in 1848, was sometimes white.
Mulatto.
Well, he also married a Mexican, and so that made identifying him a little bit more
Right.
vaguer. So the Filipinos were able to integrate into the Mexican community.
Right. In Spanish.
Yeah. So it wasn't like the race riots that the Chinese community had experienced. And so the video that showed, being run out of town, I mentioned that unfortunately it misrepresented the story because those clippings were not from San Francisco.
Fresno, you said?
Exeter and Waterloo.
Exeter. Pretty close. All right,
So-
next question, please. Over here. Wait for the microphone.
Yes, thank you so much for your presentation. I really enjoyed seeing the visualizations that you provided. I have a question regarding, I know it lies a little bit outside of the timeline that you have done for this presentation, but I'm wondering what the impacts of redevelopment were on the Filipino communities that established themselves in the Western Addition neighborhood.
So by the time redevelopment started coming into Western Addition, Filipinos had already moved out. There were still a few hundred families there. And in fact, some of the pamphlets from the redevelopment agency, the pictures of the children were Filipinos. So by 1950, the census records showed that Filipinos had moved on. The center of their settlement had been around Divisadero, and They were moving out to the Heights, some in the Mission. Actually, there were people who were moving into the Excelsior already. By the 1950s, it was the Excelsior. And to this day, the Excelsior is where the Filipinos are.
Good point. Question up front.
I just have a question of where they went to school. Were they going to Catholic schools or the public schools? Was there any problem about the school attendance? If you can comment on.
Oh, I didn't really follow that, but for example, I know Vicky Manalo went to public school. Carlos Billo went to Catholic school. I'm not sure where Sugar Pie went, but they Vicky Manalo had a very positive experience growing up in South of Market. She noted that there were just so many different people in South of Market. Because somebody asked her, "Were you teased for being biracial?" And she just looked at them. It's like, no, there were just too many different people. Bill Soto also wrote of his positive experience growing up in the Western Addition. And the Western Addition was probably the most diverse of the neighborhoods. So I actually have I have here written down what Bill Soro remembers of growing up in the Western Addition. So he was hustling the Sun Reporter, which was a black newspaper, up and down Fillmore Street every Saturday morning. He'd pick up the papers down the street from Narato's fish and poultry store, and then he worked one side from Sutter to Fulton, and then back up the other side. He'll trade the paper for pickle at the German deli, and then he remembers the aromas from the Ukrainian bakery on McAllister and Webster, the smell of barbecue from the Kansas City Hickory Pit, which was between the Long Bar Saloon and the Fillmore Theater. He'd bump to other Filipinos, and by early afternoon, he'd finish selling his papers and he'd head home, where his brothers and friends would be hanging around playing boogie-woogie on their upright piano and dancing their cares away. And his mother was white. His mother was very tiny and was born to Spanish and Scots parents. And she would sing her heart out. And that was his memory of Saturdays. I'm surprised I had this here, but I took it out.
Up front.
I just had a question about how, I know it's a little bit out of your time frame, but did the Filipinos, like in Alaska, did they fill in after the Japanese were pushed out in San Francisco?
Most of the cannery workers were in Seattle. They were based in Seattle. I mentioned so there was one community historian said that when the Japanese were pushed out, that's when the Filipinos came to the Western Addition. I just mentioned that. I just did the whole history that said they were there before the 1940s, and when the Japanese were incarcerated and the African Americans moved in, they moved further west to Divisadero. They moved sort of southish to the Heights, and further southeast to the Excelsior, the Mission and the Excelsior. So yeah, that's how the change in settlement patterns. I'm still doing the 1950 census. It's those enumeration records are difficult to to transcribe.
I think just wanted to add, Filipinos moved west and south because there was really a racial dividing line of Pine Street. You couldn't move. My family tried to buy a house north of Pine Street, and they wouldn't sell to my father
Mm.
in Japantown.
Oh, in Pine. But Carlos Villa's family were moved to the Panhandle. So,
Our family moved to the Haight.
yeah. So,
We have a question in the back.
thanks, Bill.
How you doing? My grandfather was a Mexican American prize boxer in the 20s in California, and there was a lot of Filipinos that are also boxing. So if you research like the boxing arenas in San Francisco, and it was
Yeah.
a really, because that was like the working man's sport was boxing.
Yeah.
So I guess they would box in the farm working towns and all these little areas. But I think there's a big history of probably Filipino boxers in this whole region.
Yes. And unfortunately, there was just too many things to cover. But boxing was really important in the community. And most of the boxers were from the Philippines, but some of the Filipino Americans, the ones who settled here, also started trying out their luck boxing. I think actually most of the matches were in Oakland, but they also had them at what is now the Bill Graham. They had, they did it at the Franklin Hall, but yeah, it's just a little too much to cover. I kind of like mapping, so I focus on that.
Question in front.
Teresa, thank you for this wonderful presentation. Just a real quick comment. When I saw the pictures of the black and white pictures of the fiestas, where the man looks so regal and the woman like all beautiful, it's just like wow. And they take their appearance so, handsomely and beautifully, with so much pride. But I am just curious, and this was not mentioned on your presentation. Was there a racial tensions between the Chinese versus the Filipinos, considering that they're like on these only small places, or did they form an alliance?
That I'm not really sure of. So I cannot comment on it. But historically in the Philippines, we did have some tensions. And so actually I cannot really talk about this. But there were there were Chinese Filipinos who took advantage of being Filipinos into coming into the United States, because there was still the Chinese Exclusion Act.
Right.
And as Filipinos, they were allowed to come here. And the most famous was the Fong Torreses.
I have a question up front.
Oh, he's in here.
Oh, yes. Thank you, Teresa. We heard of various institutions like schools and folk dancing and pageants and all of that. Just curious where the Catholic Church as an institution, how it was formed and how it was infused in these everyday lives.
So they were mostly men, and they formed a lot of Masonic organizations. I don't really know. I didn't really look much into the religious practices. It's mostly a woman thing. I did mention that the Irish Catholics helped them with establishing the Catholic Filipino Club, but with American colonization came Protestant religions. So, and it was a lot of the Protestant missionaries who encouraged Filipinos to come out to the U.S. to study. So there were these various churches. They were pretty small, and there were even there's one local grown church that was Filipino. It was called the First assembly of the firstborn, something like that. And they were popular, and they still exist to this day. But sorry, I cannot really answer that, and I don't wish to do so.
I have a question down front.
Thank you, Teresa. That was really great, like presentation. But I was wondering, when was the first time that the Filipinos became politically active in San Francisco? Like, was it like before the I Hotel, or like I don't know? But can you recall it from the history?
So the Filipinos, the students were fairly active. They were mostly in Berkeley, and the question of independence was foremost in a lot of Filipinos' minds. So they would voice their concerns. There would be those who are pro independence and those who want to remain as a state, as a territory, and maybe even become a state of the United States. There were people who joined unions, even if at that time unions were not friendly to minorities. I saw some news articles of, raids of communist cells, and, they arrest this Filipino. So they joined different kinds of organizations, but it was the students who were foremost in actively participating in political discussions and issues. But I also saw an article that was recruiting Filipinos to reach out to Filipino citizens. It was the Democratic Club. A lot of people think that Filipinos were not allowed to become citizens, but there were Filipino Filipinos who were American citizens by virtue of being born to an American father or an American mother. So by the 1940s, they were already of age to vote. So I thought that was very interesting, but I don't really know much other than those small articles.
Just if you think about that timeline, the 50s is kind of boring, but the 60s is where all the action is.
Yeah.
So I think that kind of fits into no matter what organization you're talking about or ethnicity, there was always something going on in the 60s into the 70s.
Yeah. But that's beyond my presentation, yeah.
You have other questions? There's one in the back.
Thank you, Teresa. I once knew an immigration attorney whom I believe argued in front of the Supreme Court regarding the promise that was given to Filipino soldiers if they served in World War II, they would automatically be granted citizenship, and then it was taken from them. But he argued in front of them, and I believe he won the case. And did that open up citizenship to these World War II vets?
Yeah, so around the 1990s here, San Francisco, you would have noticed all the Filipino veterans who came out to the U.S. to fight for that right to become citizens, given the service they had given the U.S. But it did take a while. I don't know which attorney you worked with, and I am not able to respond other than that they were granted citizenship, but after much work.
We have a question online.
Yes, we have a question coming in from our online audience. I heard from my dad that my grandfather came to the States in 1920s on the ship that looked for work. My dad told me that there were ships that brought Filipinos to the States for free. Did you run into that in your research? Is that true?
Say that
Is-
again, sorry.
So, my dad told me that there were ships that brought Filipinos into the States for free. Did you run into that in your research? Is that true? Is there a place where I can find a ship manifest?
So I don't know about free, but ship manifests could be. I think the Maritime Museum has those. I think the ancestry, if they are just doing it for themselves, getting actually go to the library, which has a free ancestry subscription, and you could just do research there. And if they look for the name of his grandfather, beyond the census records, there are manifests if they are available. So, but typically the steamships I think would cost like $75 at that time, but free I don't know. Maybe he joined the Navy. So
Well, there was an awful lot of employees who worked on ships who
yeah,
were Filipinos
so I don't know.
you know, food service and that kind
Yeah.
of thing. So, I mean, there could have been a deal being made. Who knows? So, it's a tricky question. All right, we have any other questions? All right, we're going to wrap it up. Thank you, Teresa.
Wait.